So good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Thursday night Anamkara meditation program. Thank you so much for coming. With all my heart and with all my love, I welcome you to our program tonight. You know, this is Satsang, so we get to Sat being the truth, that which is the same in all times, in all places, and refers to our highest nature, the highest nature of the universe, really. And Sangha, this gathering. And so a time to be able to gather together and become immersed in practices that bring us into that highest truth of what our nature is and the nature of the world, and be able to share also the power of our practices, our presence. And so I want to thank you for coming as you bring all of that. You bring your divine presence. The most important thing is that this entire universe and all beings in it are really that embodiment of the infinite. Coming to know that takes some practice and takes a lot of grace, but we come together in order to be able to reflect that and support that and be present with that. So thank you for coming. Tonight is the first Thursday in the month, and we're already into February now, and in our cycle of programs, this is a night when we get into some of the kind of a classic dharma talk, though I'm going to be talking about that in a few minutes. But we'll start, as we do, with opening mantras. And mantra is really at this throb, this power of the infinite. It's Shakti. And I've seen that all mantras, true mantras, have their source in Kundalini Shakti. He's the one who creates all of that. So when we're making use of mantra, we're making use of the power of the infinite. We're engaging the power of the infinite that has taken the form of mantra in order to help free our mind from being bound by all the thoughts and feelings and all the content of the mind that we're so engaged with through the day. So opening mantras are a way of helping to clear that slate, clear the mind, open it up to its true nature. Its true nature is boundless consciousness, boundless equanimity, boundless love, boundless compassion. We want to come home to that. And mantra is sort of the royal road home. So we'll start with the opening mantras and then sit for a few moments afterwards just in that stillness. Right? That's the gift of mantra, to open the stillness and into that spaciousness of awareness, where we can experience the nature of simply being without doing, without even doing a thought, without even doing a feeling. That's the doing of the mind. We set it all aside and enter that spaciousness of being. So we'll start with the opening mantras. Shri Mata Kali Devi Ki Jai Gajananam Bhuta Ganari Sevitam Kapita Jumbo Palacharu Bhakshanam Umasutam Shoka Vinashakarakam Namami Vigneshwara Parapankajam Shri Ganeshaya Namaha Shri Ganeshaya Namaha Shri Ganeshaya Namaha Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamandaya Purnamevavashishate Om Shanti 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 Shri Mata Kali Devi Ki Jai. So once again, I welcome you all with all my heart. Thank you for joining us this evening. That stillness. That stillness. If you want to know the truth, that's the real dharma talk. It's in stillness that we come to know the highest. It's in stillness where all bondage dissolves. It's in stillness where the fullness of love is known. Stillness is revelation. Stillness is transmission. Stillness is the power of Shakti, holding all. In stillness, lover and beloved merge. Take refuge in stillness. The mind arises out of stillness, dissolves into stillness. We keep inviting it back to that stillness so we can truly know what's beyond words, beyond any dharma talk, even from the Buddha himself. Words are inadequate. Oh, but the mind loves words. The mind wants to know, it goes in, and it especially wants to know in the context of thoughts and words and all those things. So we take care of the mind. We give it its due. But not because it's going to somehow capture true knowing. It's not going to capture boundaries dissolving in love. Everyone who's been in love knows the language of love is silence. So it is with the infinite. But we can help the mind. We can use words to help the mind get more comfortable with this radically different way of being and seeing. Now, the meditative paradigms is very different than our ordinary paradigm that we are so familiar with, that we live and work in. And so a lot has been written about that, how there's what's known as a paradigm clash. And so that when we look at sort of the paradigm that we're living in and thus become unconscious of, we just take it for granted. But when we step back and start to look at, well, what is the nature of the paradigm? Because paradigms shape how we see, how we perceive, what we think is possible, what's not possible, what's the meaning of things. All these are reflective of paradigms. Paradigm meaning a set of constructs and thoughts that helps to shape the way we think and the way we perceive, and thus the way we interact with what we think of as reality. I particularly like that Einstein said, reality is an illusion, albeit a persistent one. He's a great physicist. Somebody should know concrete reality. A physicist should know that, right? Our dominant paradigm is called scientific materialism. We look to material causes to explain the nature of phenomenon. And for a lot of what we deal with in everyday life, That's a very important and very useful paradigm. Whether it's researching how to produce vaccines very quickly for a virus, to how do we explore physical reality and deal with that. Scientific paradigm has been absolutely stunning in what it's empowered us to do and how much it's relieved human suffering. But when it becomes so dominant that it becomes the only way of seeing, then we wind up with some problems. Because it's one thing to see that, it's very good at being able to define and delineate certain things, but we need to go and see what's also beyond those things. And even our psychology is very much a reflection of, the Western scientific paradigm. Wasn't long ago, before Western psychology had developed to where it is, where we looked to very different causes. Western psychology will think about what was a person's upbringing. If somebody's having a problem, an issue, you don't have to be a licensed clinician like myself. People just talking. They'll talk about what did they learn, what were their behaviors, what were they rewarded for, these things that shape behaviors. 150 years ago, we might have been talking about, spirit possession as a legitimate way of talking about explaining general behaviors. So our psychology has also been reflective of advances in research and helping to understand what goes on with the mind. But again, it hasn't looked beyond what it's capable of explaining. Those things kind of get shifted aside. And so there are big differences between Eastern and Western paradigms and how we even can understand that. In Western scientific materialist paradigm, psychological paradigm, there's a big question, whether or not our normal waking state of consciousness is optimal or suboptimal. We have different views from Eastern and Western on the waking state. The Eastern and Western paradigms differ on whether or not higher states of consciousness exist, and can they be trained? Can they be the result of something that you do? Right? And they also differ in terms of what's the value of verbal communication. Something we take for granted here. Right? And especially in the scientific realm, it's publish or perish. Findings should be able to be written down, encoded in language, shared, published in a peer-reviewed journal, validated by repeated experiments that are also then encoded in language and shared. That's our Western paradigm. It's very different than where the meditative paradigms come from. So when we start to look at this shift that happens, that's in part what underlies what our practices are, because they have a different way of looking at the mind, at consciousness, what the nature of the universe is. Western paradigm, the universe is made out of material substances, and Big Bang, whatever that may have been at some point, but it's still material causes for everything. Consciousness itself in the Western paradigm is a result of material causes. In other words, neurons firing. Physiological events lead to consciousness. Therefore, if there's not a body and a brain operating, consciousness can't exist. Very different from the assumptions and even the experience of mystics from many traditions, and especially from the yogic and the Buddhist traditions. Consciousness, in fact, from the Eastern traditions, consciousness is what creates the material universe. That all of what we experience comes out of consciousness. And that we have the capacity to shift out of a state of identification with the physical domain of the body and its reflection in the brain and the mind, and enter other states of consciousness that that are not bound by physical reality. That's completely different from what Western scientific paradigm would hold to be true. And yet it's fundamental to how the practices were really explored and used to cultivate this capacity for knowing the infinite as ourself, for knowing what we are beyond the confines of body and mind. And so when we're looking at, how to shift back and forth, because often, that's what we're doing. We're shifting paradigms. But the mind doesn't, if it's not aware of the impact the paradigm it's operating in is having on its experience, then that can, again, further bind it. So in the yogic tradition, all of this is consciousness. And that nature of pure consciousness that, again, almost you could think of as the science of consciousness that the yogis and great masters went through thousands of years ago, experimenting with consciousness. Oh, if you breathe in this way, how does it impact consciousness? If you sit like this, if you detach from identification with this thought, this feeling, all these impulses that are coming up, what happens to the quality of consciousness? What happens to the quality of consciousness if you sustain a particular practice and notice that consciousness shifts from the waking state to the dream state, from the dream state to the deep sleep state? So thousands of years ago, the yogis were talking about these three basic states of consciousness and how that informs our everyday experience. And for the most part, we're identified with the waking state and the ego mind of the waking state. That same limited eye awareness is present in the dream state. The yogis saw that. And they said, yeah, but consciousness in the dream state is now starting to get free from the confines of the physical body. So that awareness, that consciousness of even an I sense in a dream isn't bound in the same way that it is in the waking state, which is identified with physical reality. So in dreams, we can violate the laws of physics. We can fly, we can go back in time, forward in time, we can appear different. All these things can change. So the yogi said, well, that's a different state, and that consciousness now is no longer so bound by that physical reality. There's still a limited sense of I, but it's not the same limitations that it's experienced in the waking state. So then, watching consciousness shift from the dream state into the deep sleep state, they notice now even that sense of I-ness associated with just identification with mind and remnants of thoughts and feelings and things of the day that can appear in dreams or be created by mind in the dreams, that limited I awareness still has a lot of content that it can be involved with in the dream states. Now as we go into the deep sleep state, that content is gone. So what the yogis saw as they were honing and refining their awareness to be fully present, watching what happens to consciousness in the deep sleep state. Now there's just a seed sense of I-ness, of me-ness. We didn't die and disappear. We don't wake up after a deep sleep and go, oh, I disappeared and came back. Where did I go? We have a sense, there's a continuity of just this barest thread of I awareness, limited I awareness. And the yogis, with their refined consciousness, could see that. And then they saw there's a state of consciousness beyond the deep sleep state. And they call that Turiya. And it's the state of consciousness of our infinite, boundless self. Beyond words, beyond thought, beyond mind, beyond any limited I awareness. So the yogis, having refined through practice over centuries techniques for being able to enter that and examine that and see that, could see that, oh, there are these, for the most part, everybody goes through three states: the waking state, the dream state, the deep sleep state, and that's it. That defines their whole life. And the conditioned mind, the limited I awareness that operates through those states, that is where this suffering resides. It rests in that, with the limitations that go with that sense of I, that it has some things and lacks other things, that it feels some kinds of pain and wants to relieve that pain, that it's seeking one thing after another. All these different forms of conditioned mind. And the yogis were talking about this kind of conditioning long before we had, modern Western psychology talking in a behavioral fashion or a cognitive behavioral way about the conditioned mind. The yogis were talking about that thousands of years ago. So they have a very advanced and sophisticated understanding of how the mind operates. And so when we start to step back and making, again, use of the practices that help us defuse consciousness from the content of the mind, they saw that consciousness identified with this little sense of, I am this body, I am this role that I play, I have these functions I have to fulfill in society and my family, etc. That definition that creates that little I is a little container of consciousness. And when we're saying to ourselves, and culture and family are saying, that's who you are, then that awareness, that consciousness, takes the shape of that container, because it's fluid, takes the shape of the container it's given. Good container, bad container, it's going to take the shape, and then we'll have the experience of I am that little thing. Consciousness fused with content. So for the most part, when you look across traditions, yogic, Buddhist, meditative disciplines, they're about separating out consciousness from the content of the mind, separating out consciousness from being identified with all those little things, so that we can then regain the fullness of the experience of the consciousness that's in that little container. But freed of the container, it's boundless in nature. It's infinite in nature. It's not bound by the states that the body and the brain go through. The states of waking, dream, and deep sleep, those are body and brain states. Sure, when consciousness is identified with them, we have that experience. But that's where they discovered the difference with this fourth state, the state of the self, the state of the infinite, beyond words, this turiya state, this transcendent state. Well, and one thing they discovered was it's continuous. Continuous. All the time, in all places. That's what Sat in Satsang, Sat Chidananda, Sat, the highest truth, that which is the same in all times and all. What is that? Consciousness. Boundless consciousness. With certain other boundless qualities. In the yogic formulation, it was often talked about as Sat Chit and Ananda. Sat, that infinite boundless consciousness being. Chit is the consciousness and the power of consciousness. And Ananda is this joyous, blissful, rapturous experience. When Buddha talked about it, he talked about boundless wisdom, because it knows all as itself. Boundless joy, boundless compassion, unshakable, boundless equanimity. That's how Buddha talked about the four immeasurables that are qualities of that boundless awareness. So the paths of the meditative disciplines are aimed at coming to know that, and to be able to know it and become so immersed in it so frequently that it literally shifts the locus of our identity from that limited I awareness to the boundless one. The limited I awareness is subsumed in that. That Turiya state encompasses the three ordinary states of consciousness and transcends them. So it's all inclusive. It doesn't leave it out. We don't have to kill the body. You don't have to kill the mind. You don't have to kill the ego. We just have to be able to pry consciousness free from being so wedded to it that it can't see past that. And that's a very different construct of then what's possible and what we're capable of as human beings than Western psychology. Because that holds a very different view, whether it's through cognitive behavioral and traditional Western psychology, seeing humans as, at the best, they're adaptive, and the pleasures of life are accessible, however limited they may be. Freud had a darker view. He talked about successful therapy as changing the extreme suffering of the neurotic into the normal misery of human existence. That's how Freud put it. And one of the great mystics and sages and saints, no, oh my gosh, we're capable of knowing the infinite and the boundless love, the boundless compassion, the boundless wisdom, the boundless strength. My God, that's what we're capable of. If you put out a vision of people that says they're just capable of this, then people believe it. They live it. And out of that limitation comes all the sense of lacking and wanting. Then we develop an economic system that says, oh, you're in such pain for lacking and wanting. Let me sell you this and sell you that and sell you some other thing you don't need. But it's going to make you feel better. No, it's not. But you can see our economic systems, our social systems, they're based on this root of ignorance of the truth of who and what we are. So that's why when Buddha talked about finding a way to get free of suffering, he wasn't talking about relative suffering. So in the Eastern traditions, we'll differentiate sort of the relative causes of suffering and the absolute cause of suffering. The relative causes are the things we would think of, whether do we have enough to eat? Do we have warmth and shelter? Are we secure? Do we have, caring relationships? The things that the absence of will cause suffering. That's not what Buddha was talking about. That is part of what this vehicle of mind and body goes through in its time on this planet. He was talking about consciousness itself. How does consciousness get free of suffering? And was there a way to get totally free? Radically free? Permanently free? And that's what both the yogic disciplines and the Buddhist disciplines were aimed at, that kind of radical freedom. And in the yogic system, the power of consciousness, that is the root of that freedom, is known as Kundalini Shakti, this innate power of revelation and transformation. That's when I wrote the book, Awakening Kundalini, The Path to Radical Freedom. That all the practices culminate in that inner awakening. That's why Buddha just said, awake. Buddha means awake. Fully awake. Fully aware, unbounded by the conventions of mind and body, yet able to live within those conventions without being bound by them, able to live skillfully, to bring loving compassion, wisdom and grace, equanimity and steadiness into the world. That's what we're called on, to know and to do. That's what's really known in the Eastern traditions as the hero's journey. is coming to know that. That was the great heroic task, was to conquer the mind and go beyond it. Much harder to do than to conquer another country, another people, whatever. Those are nothing compared to taking on the mind, taking on this conditioned pattern of identification with each thought, each feeling, each reaction that comes up. So the practices are aimed at cutting the very root of suffering. The very root of that. That's why through meditative practices we can have experiences where even if the body is suffering, has been hurt, has been injured, we can have an experience of profound transcendence, going beyond the confines of the body, even while knowing the body is suffering, but our consciousness isn't bound to that. So all the practices are really aimed at unfolding this whole other state of consciousness that we, for the most part, wouldn't even know existed. It's not even a part of our cultural language. Our language, the aspirations that are defined culturally, religiously, don't include that. So we have to know what's possible in order to go for that. And really that's what the great mystics, the sages and the saints across traditions have pointed at. We're capable of knowing on that level. And from that level being able to see all the forms of suffering that unfold in the world, unfold in large measure because of that ignorance of the truth of who we are. Now, knowing that, of course, yes, you can hurt the body, and there's the relative causes of suffering can still exist, but the absolute freedom that comes, as well as the freedom to act with selfless love, selfless compassion, selfless generosity, that is what motivates us. That's what then drives us. Very different. Back in the time of Buddha and the early sages and saints from the Upanishads, there were oligarchs then. They were called Maharajas. And they could be horrible characters and horrible kings. They knew what it was to suffer under that. The ones inflicting the suffering were themselves suffering that ignorance. Because in our ignorance, we flail about and inflict suffering on others. And each and every one of us has by our birthright the capacity to know the infinite, to get free on that level, and have our actions and our way of walking in the world transformed. So we then walk in dharma. We walk in congruence with what we know to be the truth of who we are and the truth of all beings. We may not experience it every moment of every day, but we begin to have those experiences. And then those experiences begin to happen more and more frequently, anytime, any place. And that's what starts to really shift that sense of, who am I? Tattvamasi, thou art that. The Mahavakyas from the Upanishads, thou art that, the infinite, that infinite, all-encompassing one. Thou art that. It was first written in the Chandogya Upanishad 3,000 years ago. This is not a new truth. On this level, the truth is eternal, unchanging. We come home to that. And stillness is where we start to really be able to encounter that. The stillness, the silence, the spaciousness of pure being. It surrounds every thought. So even if the mind is thinking, it's surrounded in stillness. It's surrounded in the luminous light of awareness. What illumines that thought? What illumines that feeling? What illumines that memory? What illumines that sensation? That luminous consciousness? What illumines deep sleep? What illumines a dream? What illumines your experience right now? That luminous consciousness? That's the infinite. That's the infinite. And mantra arises out of that. Mantra is a throb of that. It starts literally as a thread of light. Then as it becomes more defined, that vibration, it starts to take on a coarser energy until it becomes the level of thought. Then it becomes even coarser, becomes the level of sound. The Om arises out of stillness, out of silence, out of the bindu, that point, the portal between the infinite and the finite, between the supracausal body, the state of Turiya, and then the deep sleep state, the sleep state, the waking state. So when we become absorbed in mantra, we become absorbed in this gift of the infinite. It can take us back into the stillness and the silence, and dissolve the very root cause of suffering, identification with mind and body. It opens the portal for the fullness of your being, your boundless state of love, of compassion, of wisdom, of steadiness and strength. To walk that into the world, anytime, any place, all times, all places. To help relieve the suffering of everyone. There is no other. We can't be free while others are bound. So even as we endeavor to know the highest, live in that freedom, there's also this loving compassion that just spontaneously dedicates us to wanting all to be free. Everyone, all beings, in all places. So when we sit to do a practice like we're going to do in a few minutes, we're going to be chanting the mantra Om Namah Shivaya. This throb of the infinite means I bow to the the auspicious one, the divine, the boundless one. So when we sit to do that, we want our mind to understand the profound nature of what we're doing. To bring that sense of awe and respect and reverence to your practice. If you were going to sit and have the darshan, sit in the presence of God herself, imagine how you would go. Imagine how you would prepare yourself to have that divine audience. Can we bring that mindfulness to how we sit for meditation? For the environment we create for meditation? For the reverence? For the practice? The power of that practice? That can set us free and other beings free? We want to bring that awareness. Mindfulness isn't a practice of just about how do I breathe in and how do I breathe out. That's just the foundational training to have a steady mind. Then we want to be aware, continuously aware of that presence that is our nature. And that we live in that presence. We know that presence. We respect and revere the presence of the infinite as our own being and the being of all. So easy to get caught up and forget. And just return to, oh, I'm this person, I'm this body, I'm this mind, I'm this role, I'm this job, I'm this task. Let it go. Come home to the truth of who you are, and live that with delight and joy, enthusiasm. Enthusiasm, it's a great Greek term. Literally means to be possessed by a god. God is yourself. You can be enthusiastic about the practice of being in the presence of the Infinite One. So we're going to chant the mantra Om Namah Shivaya for a few minutes. And then just sit in the stillness. The mind moves, let it move with mantra. If it becomes still, just enjoy that boundless spaciousness of being, the truth of who you are. Mata Kali Mahadevi Ki Jai. Om Namah Shivaya. Oh
Kali Mahadevi ki jai.
So we end with this prayer. Then may all our practices truly benefit everyone, and may all beings know complete freedom from suffering. Namaste. So keep coming back to that stillness. It's so inviting. As you get past the mind, it becomes more inviting. Just be at just the other side of that veil of thoughts. This boundless field of love, this boundless field of light. It's yours. It's who you are. The truth of who you are. But even drawing near that, even becoming a bit quieter, a bit more still, empowers us. In the same way that when we draw so close to the infinite in deep sleep, we awake so refreshed. In meditation, we draw close consciously. And we pass that final boundary to dissolve into the one. And then the mind and body drenched in that can walk it into the world. Dripping love, kindness, compassion, wisdom, strength. Strength is there. The truth of who you are. The truth of why you've taken birth. To know that, to revel in that, and then to share it for the benefit of all. So thank you for coming. Thank you for coming this evening and bringing all that with you. Your sublime presence, the power of your practice and intention. The ways you walk it into the world each day. Thank you. So drown the mind in mantra, so we can drown it in stillness and silence. There you can revel in the truth of who you are and who all beings are. And we can live that into the world together. Transform the world. Revolutionize the world. Well, thank you. And thank you for all the ways that you support Anam Cara and share our e-newsletter and YouTube channel and for your generous donations that enable us to keep going. So thank you for all that. Most importantly, thank you for being you and walking in this world at this time where we need people awake, loving, compassionate, and strong. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you next week.